Hi. In this video, I want to introduce you to the filters menu. Filters menu is right up here in Photoshop. It's one of the oldest areas of Photoshop. It's gotten quite a bit more complicated since the first iterations. But this used to be the first place that everybody would go when they first got Photoshop because it had all sorts of trippy, cool things that you could do to your photos. You know, you could go down to Pixelate and choose something like Crystallize. And you can see that it pulls up this little preview. You can make these big kind of crystally chunks, make them bigger or smaller, leave about like that, and turn your whole image into this crazy, wacky, crystallized motif. Well, that was pretty cool, but I'm not quite sure in this case what kind of application you might use this for in a practical sense. The other thing about it to keep in mind, let's pretend this could be practical, this particular filter. The other thing about it is that you have to keep in mind that it is quite destructive. It's rearranging the pixels in that pixel layer. If I were to save this image now and I didn't have my backup, I would be stuck with these pixels. There's no backtracking on this. So be sure to have a backup layer. In later videos, I'm going to show you a couple of different strategies for working non-destructively. But for now, your best bet is to simply make sure that you're working on a copy of your original layer. There's going to be some other advantages that I'm going to show you in this particular video as well about having that layer underneath in order to work more creatively and effectively with your filters. For now, though, I'm just going to Command Z, come out of there, and I'm going to start with the most practical filter of all and work my way down. Let's just take a look at this filter menu so you can get an idea of how to navigate it. Up at the top, you'd see that we have the very last filter that we used is always up there for your convenience. The next one is Convert for Smart Filters. We'll get to that in 2 more videos. And then we have a series here. Most of these are, a few of these are specialized. We'll get to them if you take my interior-exterior class. But a couple of them are one of them is super pragmatic and one of them is super crazy. Let's start with the most pragmatic tool and we'll work our way down to Liquify and then to the larger menu below. So this is called, oops, there it goes, the Camera Raw filter. And this is a fairly new feature in Photoshop. It's absolutely awesome. So how many times have you gotten into Photoshop and thought, gosh, I really should have done XYZ in Lightroom before I came over here because it doesn't really work as well in Photoshop and I'd rather get my image up to speed before I could keep working. Well, this is your best answer. You could go back to Lightroom and relaunch, or you could use the Camera Raw filter. Remember that Camera Raw is pretty much exactly like Lightroom. So if you're really into the texture, let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. We have our texture option. We have all of the different gradient options, all of the different hue and saturation, everything that you work with, your sharpening, your masking, all of this stuff that you work with in Lightroom, you can work with here directly in Photoshop using the Camera Raw controls. And we'll just go ahead. You can just sharpen a bit. I'm going to go back to the main menu and take my highlights up, add my little bit of clarity, and just say OK. I haven't done a lot of changes, but if I click this off, you see I've made some changes in the Camera Raw filter. And that's very, very handy. So that's probably the most pragmatic filter that you'll come across in the filter menu. One of the least pragmatic is right underneath it, and this is the Liquify. Although this does have a lot of applications, it's really, I have to say, it's really not a filter, but it is in the filters menu now. It's used a lot in the fashion industry for giving women super skinny waists. And it actually has a lot of applications for portraiture retouching, which I'll get into in the portraiture class. But it's also quite a fun, sort of playful, imaginative tool. In its simplest form, you just have a brush tool that can be large or small. And the most common tool is this one at the top, which is just a way of just pushing pixels around. And you can do this with a large brush or a small one. The larger the brush gets, the more pixels you're grabbing at once. And the smaller the brush, the fewer pixels you're grabbing. You can just sort of mush things around however you want. Now, there are some very pragmatic uses for the Liquify tool. Most people I know tend to be very playful with it. It can be a whole lot of fun. Now, it uses up an awful lot of memory, and it is highly destructive. Let me show you a couple of good features up here to know about. One is the Reconstruct tool. So if you decide that you want to leave this area more normal, or you want this part of his wing to be more normal, you can actually just paint over it and reconstruct it. That's pretty handy. This tool here is the Smooth tool, which will help to just smooth areas that you've worked on. You can also play with things that are a little bit more, excuse me, it's getting in my way, things that are a little bit more goofy. You can twist things around. You can pucker things. Let's use it on these stripes so you can see what happens there. So there's all sorts of crazy things you can do. You can change all sorts of different settings on your tools. I don't have time to go into that. But you can play with that. And when we get into portraiture, I will actually get into this quite astonishing and relatively new area called the Face Aware Liquify. For now, though, I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of there, but you'll know that it's there. Again, super destructive, so be sure you have that layer copy before you get too much further. Let's head on down the line and let's go ahead and go into the blur gallery. I'm going to show you the blur gallery really briefly first, and then we're going to go back up to blur and I'll show you another effect. So let's just pull up iris blur. Notice that the blur gallery all comes up. We have field blur, iris blur, tilt shift, path, and spin blur. And these are all some very sophisticated, relatively new tools. You can see how much energy they take up because it can take a while for it to load if you don't have a super large or powerful computer or a slow drive or a fast drive. Now, once you get into it, though, there's all sorts of things you can do with it. You can move this tool around. The iris, of course, more blurred around the edges, sharp on the inside. Two places that you can change your blur. I'm going to go ahead and exaggerate it so you can see how this tool is working. I can do it there, or I can do it on this little circle. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it exaggerated so you can see some of the other effects. I can grab any part of this outer ring and I can make it larger. I can make it smaller. I can make it more square, which can be useful, not probably for the skull, but for other applications. And I can also tweak it this way so that it's more oval, and I can turn it so that it runs more across the image. And last but not least, I can actually change the width or the width of this blur. So it's smaller or closer to the edge or larger so that it expands more. These are options that are in the iris blur, but if you go to any of these other areas, the tilt shift, the field blur, all of these do various different kinds of blurring, and they all have very wonderful, sophisticated controls. One of my favorite areas, I use the iris blur and the tilt shift fairly frequently on my work. But let's go ahead and cancel out of that. So I want to show you, there's another blur area, and these are actually older tools, which is why I think they left them split. Sometimes it's hard to figure out why. And many of these are useful. You're free to play with them, but my favorite here is an old tool called the Motion Blur. Very simple, very handy. I can increase the speed. I can decrease the speed. That is just making it more, or the distance, just making it more exaggerated. I can change the angle. I'm going to leave it kind of like this, actually, I think the opposite way. So he's heading up. Take it down here. So it's a really fun and interesting tool. Now, you notice that it blurs everything. Unlike the later tools, there's no control for like saying, don't put it here, put it here. But there is a very simple way that you can work with layers in order to create a strong effect. So I'm going to go back to this. Notice that I have my normal layer underneath, my blur layer up here. I'm just going to add a mask, number masks. I'm going to go over to my gradient tool, which is right here. I'm going to make sure that I am on this black and white gradient. Make sure that I have the first area checked. This is the gradient tool, the linear gradient, excuse me. I want the mode to be normal. This is one of those other places where you find blending modes, but we want it on normal. And we want the opacity 100%. Once you get there, you're just going to make sure you're on the mask itself. And I'm just going to start on one edge and go to the other edge. And it went the wrong way, which is fine. So it's got a gradient that way. I'm just going to Command I and inverse it. And you can see now that that blur is only applied to the one side. And it seems like he's blurring out at the back. Now, if I decide that I want to actually make that a little bit more minimal, I'm going to go ahead and Option Delete, open that up. And I could actually experiment with the length of my gradient. I could just do it a little ways. Oops, I wanted to do it actually the other way. And just do it a short distance. Oh, actually I want to start here and do it a short distance. There we go. So that I'm actually just minimizing a little bit. You can see that I can play with how much or how little of that gradient shows up. And change the effect. When I take this off, it's normal. It's just that I'm blocking that part of that. Now, I want to show you one more thing before we get out of here. Actually, two. I lied. But I'm going to Command Z, go back, and take this out. I want to show you the noise, add noise filter. And I'm putting this on this top layer. So I want to make sure I'm, yep, that's what's wrong here. I want to make sure I'm out of this. Option Delete, Command, 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 Command. There we go. Okay, and one more. So let's go up to the noise filter, add noise. And you notice here you can increase the amount of the noise. You can make it uniform or Gaussian. You can make it monochromatic or colored. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it on monochromatic and Gaussian, and I'm going to increase it just a little bit. And you might be thinking, well, sure, that's cool, but it's just sort of obscuring the whole image. Now, this is tip number 2 besides the mask, and I'll actually use a mask and a blending mode on here. This is where blending modes become incredibly useful, because I can just come through and just add a blending mode and notice how that integrates it, makes it more subtle, makes it more like a film grain. And I can also change the opacity a little bit so it isn't quite so dramatic. I can also, and I'm just going to cheat here and grab a mask that I already made. I can add a mask onto it so that the gull itself is not as grainy or is not grainy at all. I can inverse it. So the gull is grainy and the background isn't. I can inverse it again, and I could actually change the opacity of that mask so that the gull is a little bit grainy, but the sky is grainier. So you can see all the different options. Okay, I'm going to do one more effect. And I'm going to go ahead and just delete that and Command J, make a new one, just because I find this one a little bit entertaining. I'm going to go down to Render, which has a bunch of very silly effects in it. But it does have one sort of kitschy effect that I think is really cool. And that is the lens flare. This you can actually increase or decrease. You can move where you want the flare to be, which is really handy. You can even change the different lens effects, even into a movie prime. So I find this, it's a little bit kitschy, but it's very realistic. And it's actually often a nice way to just add another sort of expressive layer onto your video. So there, or onto your image. So there you have it. That's the introduction to filters. In the next video, I will get into using filters in a more sophisticated, non-destructive way.